This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Emilia Leese, and welcome to Season 4 of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to my book titled Think Like a Vegan, which is also available in paperback and audiobook. I can hardly believe this podcast project is in its 4th year. When I started, I just thought I'd record the first 8 episodes and that would be it. But there were listeners, and you've kept returning, and there are so many interesting vegans out there doing remarkable work who should be platformed. So here I am, once again. One change, though. From this season, I'll release 1 episode per month for the next 12 months, and then we'll see. What's Season 4 going to be about? I'd say the usual. History, power, animals, nature, and how it all ties in with veganism. I'm very excited for you to hear from all my guests. Today's guest is someone who doesn't just discuss veganism. He fundamentally transforms how we think about it. I'm thrilled that philosopher and culture critic John Sanbonmatsu kicks off this season. John is the kind of thinker who cuts through the noise with razor-sharp clarity, challenging assumptions about ethics, animals, and our place in the natural world. If you haven't encountered his work yet, I strongly encourage you to seek out his writings and lectures. They have a way of rearranging your perspective in the best possible way. His latest book, The Omnivore's Deception from NYU Press, isn't just another take on vegan advocacy. Oh no, it's a profound exploration of the stories we tell ourselves about meat, morality, and human nature. Stories that, as John reveals, often say more about our cultural blind spots than they do about the truth. You can find The Omnivore's Deception wherever books are sold, or better yet, request it from your local library. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's delightful to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, Emi.
Before we hear from John, here's a bit of background about him. John is a writer, philosopher, and cultural critic. He lives in Massachusetts in the United States and teaches philosophy at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He's the editor of Critical Theory and Animal Liberation and author of the Postmodern Prince, Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of a New Political Subject. You can find more information and links to his work at johnsanbonmatsu.com, and of course, I'll link everything in the show notes. And I'll just read a short passage from the introduction to The Omnivore's Deception, which I think sets the tone perfectly, both to the book and as an insight to John's personality. I certainly am, and I appreciate people who are forthright. And he's certainly that. John writes, I argue in this work that exploiting and killing other beings for human purposes is morally indefensible, and that we should abolish the meat, egg, dairy, and fishing industries. However, this book is no more about veganism per se than Rosemary's Baby is a movie about becoming a first-time mom. Rather, it is about civilizational error, about what happens when we organize our society, economy, and daily lives around a radical evil, then engage in self-deception to keep the truth of that evil from ourselves. With that, John, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I thought I would talk a little bit about how I came to write this new book of mine, The Omnivore's Deception. Because it took me a long time to write this book, and I realized, and kind of in retrospect, that I've been working on this my entire adult life without quite knowing it. But when I was in college in the 1980s, early 1980s, I had a philosophy class out in Western Massachusetts, and we read a famous essay by the philosopher Peter Singer called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And in that essay, Singer argues, he's a utilitarian philosopher, and he argued that the person reading his essay had a moral responsibility to devote 90% of their income to the people who were then starving in Bangladesh. And I set out in my philosophy course to refute his argument. And it was very troubling because I couldn't at the time. I thought that he was really right. And so it created a kind of a crisis of conscience in me, and it made me really think about my social responsibility to others. Well, it was some months after that, I was in a bookstore in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I came across a book I'd never heard of called Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. So having read his work before, I read that book. And in Animal Liberation, Peter Singer argues that other animals feel pain and pleasure, and we should take their suffering into account morally. And so as a result of that, I became a vegetarian. And then a few years after that, I became a vegan. So that was, oh my gosh, over 30 years ago. And since then, for 30 years, I've been thinking about these issues and talking to people about these issues, about how we treat the other animals we live with, the other beings of the earth. And, the more I've thought about it, the more I've talked to people, the more I've come to realize that this system that we have, which Richard Ryder named speciesism, which is a term also that Peter Singer used in his book Animal Liberation, this structure of speciesism or human supremacism, by another name, it's the fundamental condition of our life on the earth. I mean, it really is. If you look at animal agriculture, you look at the fishing industry, these structures of violence, these material structures of power, economy, and therefore society, are the most extensive artifacts ever built by our species. I mean, it's so massive, it dwarfs all of our cities and roadways and other built structures. Agriculture alone takes up, I can't remember, maybe 70% of the Earth's arable land, or the Earth's surface, and then 80% of that is animal agriculture. So it's just this massive thing. And because it's so massive, it then comes to define the way we see the world, and the way we see one another, and the way we see our fellow beings, the way we conceive of, quote, the environment, which, in Latin really means a surrounding something. But we're not, it's the world, nature is not surrounding us. We are part of nature, right? And we've forgotten that. So one of the consequences of all this is that we're undermining the conditions of all life on Earth, right? So that the animal system today is the most destructive force on the planet ecologically. It's just, and no one seems to understand that. I mean, the public doesn't understand that. So what prompted me to write this book, because there have been a lot of wonderful writers writing on animal ethics issues, right? In fact, dating back to Pythagoras 3,000 years ago, almost 3,000 years ago. Now, Pythagoras didn't write about this issue, but he was a vegetarian, and the cults that developed out of Pythagorean thought lasted for thousands of years. And that's one tradition. Then you have Buddhism, which also developed an ethic around vegetarianism. So these are old ideas. And it just seemed to me, as I, went through my own life, seeing the way that vegans and vegetarians were ridiculed and still are, that all of these wonderful theories about animal ethics and why we should treat other animals differently have not made any difference whatsoever. Now, that's a strong statement, and, we could point to some superficial changes, but the fact is that per capita meat consumption has been going up. The fact is that in spite of the range of new vegan and vegetarian options to the public, people still do not question the animal system. At my university, whenever there's some kind of function, faculty function, they will serve nothing but animal products. And no one thinks, first of all, no one thinks that's odd. Secondly, no one would think that by participating in that, there's an ethical issue at all. So, the bottom line is we, as I argue in the book, we have this very contradictory and irrational attitude towards our fellow beings, right? Many people have grown up with a cat or a dog or other companion animal in their lives whom they treat as a member of their family. They're solicitous of their health. They have compassion for them. They understand that they are a unique individual, that their lives matter, that they have kind of unique perspectives and temperaments. So we have that knowledge. And it isn't merely an anthropomorphic projection, blah, blah, blah. It's really seeing, our dog companion as they are. Well, on the other side of that, then we have this massive system for exploiting, dominating, and killing equally sensitive, equally intelligent, equally emotionally complex beings in the billions and literally trillions. No one really knows how many marine animals are being killed in the fishing industry, but it's estimated to be as high as 2.7 trillion per year. And that isn't including maybe another trillion fish being raised in aquaculture, in factory farming for fish. But at any rate, so we have these two ways of treating and approaching other animals, and they're completely contradictory. Obviously, right? You can't, if you're going to treat members of this group both as loving companions and as essentially disposable trash or worse, slaves, and so forth, at the same time, then you have a problem. And that problem kind of is what I'm trying to get at in my book, and trying to expose this contradiction. Because these are not just contradictory ideas, I argue they're contradictory ways of living a human life. What do I mean by that? I mean that existentially, we've organized life on this planet around mass violence, and yet we do that in a way that undermines and is in contradiction with our own values, our own better natures of, as beings capable of love and respect for others. And it's, in thinking about these issues, it's just been so striking to me how bizarre it is that in no other moral domain that I can think of, would we say that opposite forms of behavior, opposite principles are equally valid. And in my book, for example, I give the example of, caring for an elderly person. No one would say that caring for, an elderly parent is the same as throwing them down the stairs, or that loving a child is neither better nor worse than cutting the child's throat. I mean, I know that sounds so obvious, but this is how we view other animals. And even in the same newspaper, I read the New York Times every day, and you can read the Times, and on the same page even sometimes you'll see some profile of like a vegan chef and of a deer hunter. Or there'll be, something about, some human interest story, sentimental story about, the suffering of or death of a beloved panda bear at a zoo, but at the same time, just a little blip about the gassing to death of 6 million mink to contain COVID-19 or something like that.
We'll pause for a musical interlude, after which we'll return with more from John Sanbonmatsu. Matthew Gerstenberger's soundscapes are back this season, and I'm really excited. Matthew is a seismologist, vegan, and spends a significant amount of time in Japan, and you'll hear those influences in the music. He's been contributing his delightfully haunting and otherworldly musical soundscapes since season 2 of my podcast, and I always look forward to hearing what he's come up with. This time, Matthew teams up with his friend Chiyako on vocals. This piece is entitled 7 a.m. we're back for the second part of John Sanbonmatsu's discussion of his work, philosophy, and his book, The Omnivore's Deception.
My book really is about trying to bring this contradiction out into the open and to examine it, because we don't want to examine it. And the thing about the animal system is, on the one hand, you have this massive propaganda system. You've got billions of dollars being spent to advertise and reinforce the meat economy, eggs, dairy, fish, and so forth. And the meat industry realized some years ago that they had to defend themselves against ethical claims and environmental claims. But at the same time, there's this self-deception that goes on, and I talk about that in terms of existential bad faith. That is to say that most people do not want to think about these issues. And so if, there are all these jokes about vegans. How do you know when there's a vegan in the room? Because they'll tell you, etc. And so really people feel threatened by not just environmentalists, but by vegetarians and vegans, because of this cognitive dissonance that they really don't want to have to confront. That avoidance, as I have said, is literally undermining the conditions of life on Earth. It's our domination of animals is the leading cause of the extinction crisis, mass extinctions. And that crisis, which no one talks about, by the way, it's not even on the horizon of, in my country, Americans' top polled concerns. At most, people talk about global warming, right? And they don't understand that, all the animals on the earth are dying, and that global warming is only part of the reason why that's happening. And that at bottom, it really is these two entwined systems I talk about, speciesism and capitalism, which have become so intertwined there, can't really separate them. That's the cause of all this. So we have an existential stake in simply ending this behavior so that we can survive and flourish on this planet, because there isn't another planet to go to. Whatever the techno-futurists tell us, this is the one we have. So we had better take care of it. And the way to take care of it is actually to learn to love and respect the lives of other beings. So my book looks specifically in the first, half or so, and a little bit beyond that, looks specifically at a new way that's being used to justify this domination and killing of other beings. And I call it omnivorism. It's a kind of ideology developed by many, many people, but most famously by Michael Pollan, the food writer, in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, in 2006. That book was followed by Barbara Kingsolver in 2007, another very big national bestseller here in the US called Animal, Vegetable, Miracle. And essentially, this mythology has developed that we can raise and kill animals, quote, humanely and sustainably. That's been because the meat system, the animal system, is in such crisis. The ecological problems, the health or epidemiological problems like avian flu, spreading, and the ethical problems with this system are such that there needs to be a new way of legitimating or justifying the system. So, in a certain sense, the idea that we can morally exploit and harm other animals for our purposes, that goes back thousands of years, for sure. You can find this in the Old Testament. But there's this idea was always kind of implicit in human culture. Now it's been made explicit and it's being defended. So you have hundreds, perhaps thousands of writers, journalists, food critics, television producers, filmmakers, all working on the same project to reinforce and defend the animal system. And so piece by piece, I tried to take these ideas apart and show why they are ideological. That is to say, they're there for the purpose of reinforcing a kind of system of exploitation and violence. So, in academic terms, I'd call this a new mode of legitimation, but you can just think of it as a new way of talking about our dominance in order to defend against any critique that might unsettle it. So I'm happy to go over different chapters in the book, but it's I'm trying to give a kind of comprehensive critique. When I say comprehensive, I don't mean total, because the system is so massive. It has so many different dimensions culturally, in terms of our own sexuality, in terms of the educational system. It's a massive system, but I'm just trying to look at this problem mostly from the point of view of recent justifications for it. Because unless we can peel that away, we can see the problems with that set of justifications. There's no way we're going to be able to dislodge it.
And I think you do that. It's a sweeping book in the sense of in scope and in breadth of the various topics that you cover and so forth. And you look at it. It's both practical in the sense, not practical isn't the right word. I think pragmatic in the sense that you look at the systems and what actually happens, and you delve into a relative amount of detail there. And then you also contextualize that, and you put that all together with the history and the philosophy and also your own personal anecdotes. You have some really lovely anecdotes in there, especially about your cats, and that I found very moving, and I quickly had to stop reading it or like fast forward reading it, because then I thinking about my own cats who died this past year.
Oh, so sorry.
And it's awful, and but the way so it's both a very it's an academic book in the sense of its breadth, but it's not an academic book in the way that it's accessible to everybody, and it's also personal, and I think that's really important. I think it's really important to be able to speak to everybody about these topics. I don't think they should be they should have corners that are only for this person or that person, and that sort of, or the experience that the person might have. So I think it's really important.
I went back and forth for years. I've been working on this book for years. I went back and forth a lot on whether to talk about my relationship with my cats, because one of the ways that the animal system is defended against is through charges of sentimentality and anthropomorphism and so forth, right? And the society has a kind of demeaning and patronizing view of cats and dogs and so forth. And then cat lovers and dog lovers, they're... So, well, right? So, so eventually I did include, that section, but it comes later in the book, right? And there's a reason for that. It's so that people can first see and hopefully empathize somewhat with the farmed animals, right, that we're exploiting, who are the main ones, right? And then I talk about my personal relationship with my cats.
And I think that adds a really nice dimension to the book, and it makes an author more real and personal to the reader, and I think that's really important too. And it doesn't take anything away from the farmed animals. It doesn't take anything away from the concepts. I mean, it's all part of it. One of the things that I've experienced, and actually I experienced relatively recently, I was at a conference talking about how the left should include veganism in its praxis. And pretty much immediately after my talk, one of the questions was, oh, well, you're you're erasing all the humans who have been farming, you're erasing all these lives, and so forth, which I never said that, and I don't hold any of that. But it was interesting that sometimes the questions, even though the panel was made up of 3 of 4 presentations were by vegans and about animals, essentially, that the immediacy of the response, even though you knew what you were coming in for, was to say, well, what about the humans? Which, I've explored it with a variety of people. I explore it all the time myself in terms when I talk with people and also with previous guests. Do you find that that's the sort of the central issue, that we just place ourselves always at the center of whatever the question is, and then maybe someone else, maybe?
Yeah. There's a lot of scholarly literature criticizing the humanist tradition, humanism, which is different ways to define that. But the truth is that because we're beings immersed in language, there is a sense in which we are always going to be separate from the other species, to the extent that we have to decide amongst ourselves how to live as a species. Honeybees have been shown to be highly intelligent, right? But as far as we can tell, there isn't, here in the Boston area, there isn't a hive of bees that are talking about, well, how should we be as bees, and what are the bees doing in Africa, and how can we all kind of work out a bee project? Humans, we can't escape the fact that, as linguistic beings, we're political animals, and we have to decide how to live our lives. So that is a difference between us and other animals. But the problem, though, is that we mistake that one part of our existential identity, as linguistic beings or argumentative beings, for our true essence. And so we forget all these other parts of our personality that actually matter more to us on our daily basis, our emotional needs and our bodily needs and so forth, that are beautiful and worth valuing. And so we then view the other animals as our inferiors, and really as having lives that are worthless, which is how we can keep killing them, reproducing them, and killing them over and over again. So anyway, to get back to your really important point, we're always the frame of reference for ourselves, and we can't. It's so hard for us to move beyond kind of these myths and stories we tell ourselves about the other animals as well as ourselves, to see them as they are and to honor them as they are, so we have to, on the one hand, acknowledge, we're different in some ways that matter, for sure, but that means we have certain responsibilities. It doesn't mean that we have the right to do whatever we like to the other beings of the earth. It means that we have to be very careful with the power we have, and we shouldn't use it to dominate or to harm others,
And we're very good at that. At doing exactly not that. Not what we should be doing, but what we are actually doing. And that can be discouraging. But I don't want to be a total, just thinking about the discouraging things, because I think that there is a lot of really good work that's being done, and a lot of really good thinking that's being done, not just now, but also in the past, and consistently over time. It's 10 to 12,000 years that we have been dealing with animals, non-human animals, in the way that we have been doing, and the agricultural revolution and so forth. It's about 10 to 12,000 years. So it will take a long time to undo it and to recognize it. And actually, one of the things that because I always use this, the 10,000, 12,000 years, I always talk about that. And then I said, wait a second, but in terms of our hominid existence as hominids wandering around planet Earth, and I was writing a piece for Current Affairs where I talk about animal farming in general, not just industrial, but animal farming in general. And I said, well, how long is that 12,000 in the existence of hominids? And it's something like 0.0. So I took out my calculator and I literally just did the math. How long have hominids existed on the earth? And what's, 10 to 12,000 years? What is that? It's about 0.001% of our existence as hominids, whether as Homo sapiens or before, but as hominids. That's it. So even like, yes, it's been a long time in terms, in relative terms, because we have very short, finite lives. But in terms of our existing, it hasn't been that long that we can't realize something else and we can't materialize something else. So it's a matter of doing so, and it will take time, and whether we have that time or we don't, that's a whole other matter. And so this leads me to ask you another question, something that I have read somewhat recently, and it's in a book. Let me see if I can find it. And I can't see it on my shelf right now. But it's a little pamphlet put together by Marco Maurizi, and he makes a variety of arguments and whatever. But one of his arguments is that he sees the vegan movement as not having organized into anything that can materially change things. And I mean, he has a point to some extent, but I also find that to be a bit simplistic, because people will say, oh, but there's all sorts of charities and so on and so forth. And I don't think that that's the organization that he's talking about, or that even I would consider talking about, because that's not organization. That's just further atomizing and in making everything very individual. But the interesting point there is the organizing as in a general concept. I know this comes a little bit out of left field as a question, but I just want to get your view on that. How could we organize? And how could we organize, and also organize but understand that disagreement and discussion about the organizing and what we organize around, even that there will be discussions about that, and it's not just going to be everybody's going to organize around one sort of idea that you can come up with. And
that's a great question, and I'll try to answer it, but I don't have the solution per se.
No, I don't think you would. No, none of us do.
None of us do. But, in my first book, The Postmodern Prince, which came out of my doctoral research, I looked at the crisis of left intellectual thought. And that problem of movement building and organization and structure it's a problem not only for the animal movement, but for all the left. We have fascism on the rise everywhere. The left is completely scattered. It does not have a coherent ideology anymore, kind of with the waning of the Marxist paradigm and the, rise of the new social movements in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's a much more complex terrain. But the problem is, without organization, without leadership, without strategy, without anything like a coherent philosophy, you are dead in the water. And that's where we're at. And the problem for the animal movement, as you know, Emi, is it's much harder for us to organize, because the truth is we're organizing against, the 99% who don't want to be organized around it. People just they get their defenses up anytime their right to appropriate the bodies of other species, comes up. That said, I agree with Marco Maurizi to a large extent that, veganism has become a lifestyle. I mean, this is how people understand it, right? It's a lifestyle.
Oh, absolutely. They see it as a lifestyle. They see it as a consumerist thing, because it has been co-opted. I mean, that's one of my arguments, yes, exactly. Too, and which I heard echoed. I identified also what you were saying. I mean, it's been very much a commodification process, but capitalism does tend to sort of absorb everything into itself.
Yes, no, excellent point. I mean, in your work, as you say, in your work, it's you make this clear. And the problem is you can't change this global structure, quote, one vegan at a time. I mean, that work is important, talking to people and getting them to change how they, what they eat and how they eat and so forth. But the system is so massive, it's so entrenched, that you need to think strategically. When I say strategically, what do I mean? I mean, what are the points of leverage? What are the weaknesses within this system? Because any hegemonic or dominant system has points of vulnerability. That's even true under totalitarianism, and right. And so right now, the animal movement has something of an opportunity in the global ecological collapse, right? And the contributions of animal agriculture to climate change and so forth. The danger, though, of overemphasizing that, right, is that it leaves the ethical and political dimensions of our domination untouched. And that also leaves us vulnerable to the regenerative agriculture crowd who say, oh, well, or the bioengineering crowd. Well, yes, it's a problem that cows, produce methane. So we're going to bioengineer our way out of that, create a new cow. And in fact, I was just on the Anthropocene.com website, and they had this article about how we need to bioengineer cows so that they produce fewer methane emissions. So, getting back to the original point, we need to conceive of ourselves as a political movement and a justice-oriented movement, not as a lifestyle movement. And how to do that? I think one thing we absolutely need to do is to work within left social movements, because the left is criticizing and trying to contain the destructive forces of capitalism. As you know, the challenge, though, is that leftists are, in a way, even more than the general population, hostile to animal issues for reasons I could go into. But so that is a challenge.
That's for a different conversation, I think.
Yeah. But so in practical terms, we need to be working internationally. Like this conversation is an international conversation, but to build international structures and to not silo ourselves either as a movement. That's what I mean. It's like we need to be out there pushing other people who claim to be concerned about the environment or who claim to be justice oriented, to show the hypocrisy of positions which rest upon, unexamined assumptions of domination and mass violence. That again, that's why I think we need to work within the left.
I think that's absolutely true, and I totally agree. And it actually then reminds me of something. Helena Sheehan was one of the speakers at this conference, and now she's not vegan, and this is what I'm going to say that she said is applicable to us and to this conversation we've just had, and it's just as applicable to the left or any other space. And I think it's something that people who are now in power have been able to do very well. But she said, show up in all the spaces, talk about these issues in all the spaces where you are. And I mean, I paraphrase. So this is not a direct quote of what she said, but it's a paraphrase. But it was that. It's exactly what you said. Show up. Talk about your issues in all the different spaces, and build a community to whatever extent you can, and I think that is really important, and I think that's it's one of the things that keeps me going, because otherwise I'm not so sure I could.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I want to mention that my late friend Karen Davis, who was the most courageous activist I knew, she founded United Poultry Concerns, and
you have a wonderful anecdote in your book about her.
Thank you. Karen just died a couple of years ago of cancer, and she has this wonderful essay. Anyone can Google it, about apologizing. for our activism and so on. And I think this is just universally common among people who become vegans or animal rights advocates is, you don't want to get people upset, and you don't want to be seen as proselytizing. And Karen was completely unapologetic. And she explains in that essay that, the animals need us to not be like that. And, because the fact is that we have an insight into the nature of society that people don't have and that they don't want to hear about. But it's our responsibility to tell them. Now, there are ways, you can be self-righteous and get in people's faces and just turn them off, right? So I'm not saying we shouldn't think about our rhetorical approach and so forth. But that's different from kind of being mealy-mouthed about it or welfarist, right? The welfarist position is, we need bigger cages and we should gas them to death more humanely, and which is just, it's so incredibly counterproductive. I mean, literally, I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but I will be dramatic. The fate of the earth rests in our hands, if you want to think of it that way, because there's no way that our species, will survive, let alone all the others who are just blinking out of existence, unless we tackle this central contradiction in the human experiment, which is, that we've organized society around this violence and this mass suffering and so on. And so we have to have the strength of our convictions. And that's why, to reiterate your point, we need to go into these other spaces and not be shy about it. And and not to compromise. I think it's so important to not compromise our ethical vision and our political vision, because it doesn't help our movement in the long run.
I completely agree. And courage of conviction, not compromising those convictions. I'm not talking about not compromising with other people.
Sure.
I completely agree. I want to just thank you again. This has been such a wonderful and important conversation. And where can people follow your work, and where can people buy your book, The Omnivore's Deception?
So you can find that at the NYU Press website, New York University Press website, or if you just Google The Omnivore's Deception, it'll come up. It'll be available everywhere. And anyone interested in my work can go to my personal website, where I have some interviews and publications posted. It's just my name.com, johnsanbonmatsu.com.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Emi.
Courage of conviction. It's the thread that tied together my conversation with John, and one I know will resurface again this season. This quality has always mattered, in those I admire and in the quiet moments when I've had to summon it myself. But today, its necessity is brutal and unmistakable. As neo-fascism rises, as genocide is live-streamed from Palestine, as those in power demand our complicity or silence, to stand firm now risks everything. John mentioned Karen Davis's incisive essay on this tension, and I've linked it in the show notes, so do go ahead and read it. Karen exposes our tragic reflex. We dilute our principles to appease oppressors, hoping they'll reward our compromise. But when has that ever worked? As I wrote in Think Like a Vegan, this isn't negotiation, it's compromising down. Davis's alternative is radical in its simplicity. Be unapologetically affirmative. If you believe exploitation is wrong, whether of people, animals, or the living world, then say so, without caveats, without flinching. This isn't idealism. It's the bare minimum of moral courage.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emi Leese. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or want to suggest a guest or a topic for discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you. And you can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and on Substack and on social media. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.